So, with another one in our series on practical aspects of Christianity, and today, as I said earlier, we're looking at witnessing and work. So, first thing I'm going to say, if you work, can you put your hand up, please, just to get an idea how many we've got? Oh, a few. Okay. Obviously, a lot of people don't work. And this one's going to be a bit more awkward. When did mankind start working? Was it when agriculture was invented? We moved from being hunter-gatherers? When civilization started, the development of cities and specialist roles? The fall of mankind, i.e. the original sin and the curse that came with it? The invention of money so people could be paid? Or creation? So, let's take a thing else. Who thinks A? No? Okay. Who thinks B? No. C? Okay. D? E? Okay. Good. We'll come back to those a bit later. Today, as I say, we're looking at witnessing at work. There's quite a bit in the Bible about it. One of the reasons for choosing that last reading for Colossians is though it's talking to slaves. You know, how many have sort of talked about the 9-to-5 grind and, you know, being your bosses being slave drivers and so forth. You know, we have that same sort of attitude. We've got more freedom. That's the key thing. But at the end of the day, if you can't find a job, you can't move job very easily because you cut off the support from your family. It's a challenging place to work. It was challenging for the slaves in Colossae. It's challenging for us. And there's a couple of books that I would recommend if you want to know more about this that I'm going to go through and can go through in a few minutes. First of all, a very old one. I bought this while I was at university, called Shop Floor Christianity. And it literally is how to be a Christian on a shop floor, you know, as in the good old days of a factory. It's well worth a read, and it covers some very practical points. And the other one, which I picked up very recently, not that new, but I think is well worth reading, is this one by Mark Green, called Thank God It's Monday. And he talks a lot there about how we consider our workplace and what we do in the workplace. And it's a very easy read. I mean, I ploughed through it in about 6 hours and I was making notes as I went. So I would recommend that one particularly. And for those of you who are here, I think it was before COVID, you might remember the Christianity on the Front Line series we did. Does anyone remember that? Oh, no? Yes? No? Okay. A couple of nods. He's the guy who worked on that as well, so it's well worth looking at. Anyway, to crack on, I want to look first of all, before we get into witnessing at work, to what work is and why we work. Now, I looked for a dictionary definition, and the one I found online was work or labor is the intentional activity people perform to support the needs and wants of others, themselves, or a wider community. Okay, that comes from the Merriam-Webster one. There were others I could see but couldn't copy, and they're very similar. Now, obviously, that includes not just paid employment, which is the thing that probably springs to mind when we talk about work, but a whole range of unpaid activities that support ourselves, our families, and our communities. As the speaker in the video said, if you're a mum staying at home, looking after the young tackers, clearing up the house, you're working. And I would say probably by the time your other half gets home, you know, you're probably more tired than he is, at least physically. So someone like that, that's definitely work, it's just not paid. Then what about volunteers? Whether in the church or a charity or another organization, they give their time, they give their effort for free. But physical or mental effort, they put into what they're doing to work to achieve something for that organization. It's work. And we can even work at hobbies and pastimes. Think about amateur musicians. You know, I won't ask Say, but how many hours does Say put in practicing so that he can come here and lead us in worship on a Sunday? How many people do you know who are amateur musicians who will practice for hours so they can play in a local voluntary orchestra? Sportsmen who exercise and train so they can give the best that they can be in amateur competitions. Aren't those a form of work as well? A couple of minutes ago, I asked you to put your hands up if you worked, but there was very few. If I asked again, how many of you who are not in paid employment would change your answer? So why do we work? The most obvious reason is to pay the bills. To provide for ourselves and our families, provide food, accommodation, and then, through taxation and voluntary giving, to support those who are less fortunate than ourselves. But is that the be-all and end-all of why we work? Is it purely material? It certainly doesn't explain why people would take on voluntary roles and other roles without pay. The Bible teaches us there are other deeper reasons why we work, whether paid or unpaid. Firstly, in Genesis 1:26, we read, God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness." Okay? We're made in the image of God. And God is a God who works. Genesis 2:2, for example, tells us God finished his creation work. Jesus told us that God works. When he was challenged by the Pharisees for healing the crippled man on a Sabbath, he replied, "My Father is still working, even on a Sabbath, and I am working." John 5:17. The fact that Jesus spent almost 20 years working as a craftsman before he started preaching and teaching tells us something about God's view on so-called secular work. It's important to him. And because we are that image of God, however marred by sin it is, we have that innate desire to make something good, to achieve, to work. Then secondly, God gave us a commission to work. His plan was that we exercise dominion over the world. He gave us that instruction in Genesis 1:26. And specifically, Adam was to till and keep the Garden of Eden in Genesis 2:15. Work is part of God's plan, even before the fall. So all of those who said on the question before, yes, you were right. That instruction to work is still there. It didn't go away because of the fall. Sin just made it difficult. And then thirdly, as Barry reminded us last week, God has given each of us gifts and abilities. Not just spiritual gifts, which is what we normally think about when we talk about gifts and abilities, but mental and physical abilities and aptitudes. We're all different. I'm not a sportsman. I've run a lot, I've played tennis a bit, but I am not a sportsman. Don't put me anywhere near a football because it's dangerous. I tend to hit the other player rather than the ball. Give me a problem in physics, or how to sort out an IT problem, apart from that one, I'm your man. But, it's what are we capable of doing? You'll be able to do something different. God gives us those abilities, and he expects us to use them. And think about it. Whatever abilities you have, don't you get satisfaction from using them to the full? And isn't one of the reasons why people find unemployment and the like so difficult when they can't work is because they can't use their gifts and their abilities in their work. They don't feel they can contribute. But work should not be the focus of our world. It shouldn't be our source of self-value or our self-identity. We're made to have relationships, and especially a relationship with God. We tend to think of God's creation of people as the climax of the creation account in Genesis 1 and 2. In fact, the climax was actually the institution of the Sabbath on the seventh day, Genesis 2, 1-3. Yes, we're made to work, but as John Stott put it, we are most human when we worship, when we're in our closest relationship with God. Now, we all know work is difficult, and that's not the way it was intended. It's because of sin. In Genesis 3:17 to 19, we read of the change in the world and work that came because of Adam and Eve's disobedience. And God said to the man, "Because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree about which I commanded you, you shall not eat it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat of the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return." And the challenges of work, because obviously most of us aren't farmers anymore, we do other things, but it's still difficult, we still have struggle. Among other things, those challenges are why we can witness effectively at work, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But the first question, why don't we see our workplace as our mission field? And don't forget, I'm not just thinking here, though most of it is oriented towards paid employment, it's all the other voluntary things we do as well. Why don't we see those as our mission field? Well, one of the reasons is that the world, particularly here in the West, has placed a divide between work and faith. Faith, to the secular mind, is something private, something that has no place in the work environment. So I'm going to challenge you. Have you tacitly accepted that view? When you go to work, do you check in your Christianity at the office, shop, or the factory floor? If so, why? If we claim Jesus is our Lord, that means he's the Lord of all of our lives, including all the hours we spend at work. Now, certainly, our main reason for being at work is to work. We're paid for our efforts on behalf of our employer. And if we spend too much time doing anything that doesn't contribute to that, we are effectively stealing. We're taking our employer's money without delivering what was promised in return. And that applies as much to witnessing and time we spend doing that as it does to taking a long coffee break to have a natter or doing your online shopping during working hours for a couple of hours. But given that, why is the workplace nevertheless a good place to witness? Well, witnessing requires three things: to meet non-Christians, to build relationships with them, and to show the difference that Jesus makes in you. Now, be honest with yourself. How often have you fallen at one of those first two hurdles? How many close non-Christian friends do you have? I remember a very embarrassing time at university. It was my third year. We were just about, as a Christian Union, to launch a college-wide mission. And the missioner who was leading it took us through training. At the end of the last session, he said, "Right, that's it. You're ready. You know what you're doing. Everything's organized. You've got the rooms. All you've got to do for next week is invite your non-Christian friends." All my friends are sitting in the row with me. They were all part of the Christian Union. How many of us are like that? We're good at staying within our Christian huddle. And it's good to have fellowship. Don't not meet with Christians, but we really don't necessarily have those non-Christian acquaintances. And because we failed there, we don't have those relationships with non-Christians. We can't show the difference that God has made in our lives because they don't know us. But in the workplace, you can't fail to meet non-Christians. Best estimate is something like for every Christian in the workplace, there's at least 6 or 7 non-Christians, probably more in some industries. And think about Paul while he was in prison in Rome. He had a soldier chained to both wrists. Those non-Christians Those soldiers in Paul's case, they couldn't get away. Your colleagues at work who don't know Jesus, they can't get away from you. If their desk is next to you, yes, they're stuck with you. Yeah? There's something of a captive audience. And I don't know if you've ever worked it out, but you spend more time with the people you work with than you do with anyone else, except possibly your family. And if you count time when you're actually conscious as opposed to asleep, okay, I know how some people work, maybe not a good example, but probably as much time as with your family. You will have a good relationship. We'll have a relationship with them anyway. And most people make relationships at work, whether it's the colleague you deal with every day, the person at the next workstation, your immediate manager or your subordinates if you're a manager yourself. Those relationships are part of the teamwork that help people work together and improve productivity. And building those relations is why so many organizations spend time and money on team building. It helps their bottom line because a happy team with good relationships is a productive team. But it's those same relationships that help us be good witnesses in the workplace as well. You may well hear if someone has some sort of crisis or good news outside of the workplace. You will almost certainly know if a colleague is struggling with a piece of work, or they had good or bad news at work. They've been turned down for promotion, or they've just been fired. As a known and a trusted colleague, how are you going to respond to their need? Which leads to the third component of witnessing. At work, you share the same pressures and stresses and demands as the non-Christians around you. Somebody you meet outside of work can say, oh, you're different. You know, I'm struggling, but you've got a nice big fat bank account, you've got a big pension, you've got a decent car, nice house, kids that do what you tell them to, whatever. My world didn't like that, so how can you refer to me? In work, they get exactly the same hassle that you do. They can see how you respond to an unfair scolding, a disappointment. They can see whether you recognize the team that you're part of when you get praised, or you hog all the glory for yourself. They see how you conduct yourself in your work, and they compare it to how they do it and what their thoughts are. So we need to ask ourselves, what, or probably more importantly, who do they see? 1 Peter 1, 14 and 15 said, like obedient children, do not be conformed to the desires you formerly had in ignorance. Instead, as he who called you is holy, be holy yourself in all your conduct. The people we know see our behavior and they make a judgment about us. And if they see what they see doesn't match what it is we claim to be, they will quite rightly ignore our claims. And if we succumb to the pressure to conform to worldly ways, if our language matches those of our non-Christian workplace colleagues, if we do the same little fiddles that they do, if we take the box of pens out the stationery cupboard like they do, we're not being the salt and light in our workplace that we're supposed to be. And if we're not, Jesus gave us a warning about that in Matthew 5:13. He said, you are the salt of the earth. Not you should be, you are. But if the salt loses its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. So the challenge, how should we behave at work? Well, first, we should be diligent workers. Colossians 3:23 and 24. Whatever your task, put yourself into it as done for the Lord, not for your masters, since you know that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You serve the Lord Jesus. If we waste time, if we do an excessive amount of personal stuff during work hours, if we watch the clock and we're out the door on the dot, even if there's a critical job that needs finished, if we make other people's work more difficult because we don't take care with doing ours, Even if other people are doing all of these and more in our workplace, how does this reflect on our character and the reality of our faith? We're called to be different, to be holy. So do you see your work, paid or unpaid, as serving Jesus? Secondly, we should be honest at work. It sounds obvious, but there are always pressures to edge just that bit away from the simple truth. Haven't we all at some point had that temptation to shift the blame when something goes wrong? Probably from when we were children. Remember one case where we asked one of our children who had eaten all the icing off the top of the cake at Christmas, and his response was, "It's my little sister. She couldn't even reach the counter." But that tendency to deflect, isn't that one of the early consequences of sin? Something we see in Genesis 3, 1-11. God asked Adam if he'd eaten the fruit. What did Adam say? "She did it. She gave it to me." He was there too, but she did it. It was Eve's fault. So God turns to Eve and said, "What did you do?" And she says, "It was the serpent. He did it." At work, if something goes wrong and you're involved, are you willing to admit your part, or do you try and pass the buck? And I've hinted, did you make sure other members of your team get recognized for their contribution too? When you get praised for a joint effort being completed. In your dealings with others, are you honest and open? Can your colleagues rely on you to complete what you've started and what you said you'll do? And can they rely on you to let them know if there's a problem that comes up that you can't get over and is going to make it late? How about when you deal with customers and suppliers? If something isn't going to be ready on time or a payment can't be made on time, not only does how we deal with these things affect the relationship with the customers and suppliers, and of course, therefore, the organization we work for, but the people around see how you deal with these situations, and what they see builds their picture of your character. And again, are they seeing Jesus in you, or just another stressed and opportunist worker like they are? And how about the extreme case? When you find yourself working in a situation where you are specifically told to lie by your manager to cover up a mistake or a deliberate action. If you go back to the financial crisis, 2008, how many people covered up some of the things that went on in the banks? They knew it was wrong, they knew it was going wrong, they lied about it. And how many of their subordinates went along with those lies? Why did nobody stand up for the truth? How would you deal with that situation? Is your commitment to Jesus and thus to the truth greater than your commitment to work and potentially your job? In other words, are you prepared to resign or be fired for standing up for what is right and what is godly? And then finally, and I could pick many more things for the work environment, but I've got to keep it short. Do we build positive relationships with our colleagues? Do we know them as people or just a role? Roy mentioned I was in the Navy. I was actually a submariner. When we were in the control room on a watch, my colleagues were weapons officer, ship control, ops. They had a role to fill. In the wardroom where we lived, they were Fred, Bill, or Sir, depending how many stripes they had on their arm. What do you know about the people around you as people? Do you know about their families, the things they may be facing at home, the good things they're looking forward to? As Christians, we're called to show Jesus' love for each of those people, even the ones we struggle to relate to in a practical way. And that's difficult if we don't know them well. But if someone comes out of the boss's office looking shaken, if someone is sitting tearing their hair out in front of a computer screen because something's not working right, we can still take them a cuppa, be a shoulder to cry on. It looks needed. If someone's struggling with a piece of work, we can offer to help help with their workload, or with a particular task. Give them the benefit of our expertise if it's greater than theirs, or more specific. And by taking steps like that, we build and strengthen relationships. And such acts of practical love are likely to generate the questions that then let us talk about Jesus. Now, switching tack slightly, if you've ever been to court as a witness, you will know that you are restricted to answering the question you've been asked. And you can't go off at a tangent and actually add bits to it that aren't within the question. If we're explaining our faith to somebody, we should be doing the same. I know in the past I've been told, have a pocket full of tracts and go through it with people. I don't think that works. Don't have a theological spiel, your pre-prepared script, how to become a Christian in one lesson, ready to use with people. Talk to them. Don't preach to them. Respond to their questions. Tell them why your relationship with Jesus makes you live the way you do and the difference he's made for you. And don't be afraid to say if you need to go and find out an answer to an honest question. Most people are more open to that sort of admission that you don't know something than they are to being fobbed off. After all, we can all sense when we're being flannelled by somebody. And isn't it a real turn-off when you know fine well they're feeding you a load of whatever? And then remember, Jesus likens spreading the word to sowing seed. Yes, you put it in the ground, but it's no good going tomorrow and having a look at it to see if it's germinated, because it won't have. Seed takes time to germinate and grow. Our witness is the same. God will use it as he sees fit in his time and not ours. At some point in the conversation with somebody, conversations I should say, so it'll be we may well get to the point where we feel we need to ask the person if they want to accept Jesus. But remember, there's no rush. You are with them in your workplace hours a week, typically over several years. So don't push them, don't pressure them, don't put them beyond their comfort zone. Wait till God has worked in them first. Let the Holy Spirit guide you as you speak and as you pray for your colleagues. And if you're one of the lucky ones who knows of other Christians in your workplace, how about meeting with them regularly to pray and discuss how God is working in your organization? You might be surprised. I went into one organization and I honestly thought I was the only Christian, certainly on the floor I was on. I wasn't even sure about the rest of the 250 people. It turned out that one of my section heads was a Christian and leads a worship band. Another one we recruited as a programmer was a Christian. And a project manager who sat the other side of a partition behind me was also a Christian. So we organized to meet together to discuss and pray and support each other as a consequence. And then, even if you haven't got somebody in work who's a Christian you can share with, when you come into church, when you go to a home group, talk about your work. Not just the opportunities to witness, but also the challenges and pressures that you face there. Remember, work is your mission field. That's where God's put you. You don't need to be thousands of miles away in another country to reach non-Christians. They're there every week, Monday to Friday. And if you can meet the pressures, you talk about them with your house group mates, then all of us will be better equipped to support you and your mission at work. Practical advice, help, prayer we can give you. 1 Peter 3:14-16 says, "Don't fear what they fear, and don't be intimidated, but in your hearts sanctify Christ as Lord." That's the way we should be working. Are you worried about being made redundant? Well, don't be. You're in the hands of the living God, the one who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Yeah, he'll look after you, even if you lose your job for doing what is right. And more importantly, always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an account of the hope that is in you, but do it with gentleness and reverence. And most of all, when you're considering your workplace, pray that God will lead you to the right people, the people that He has already put there specifically to meet you and me. That your life at work then will show them Jesus, and that you'll be given the right words to say when they ask you, "Why are you so different?" Amen.